I've started it now, Gareth.
So are we on a time limit here, Kieran?
No, Gareth.
Right. Okay. So if you don't mind, I might go a little off piste and invite some of the students to answer me. I have a couple of questions for them that I hope will dig down into what they actually need to do and what they know. Are you happy enough with that?
Yes.
Okay. So look, everyone, I made my introductions earlier in the week. I'm a senior lecturer in the Centre for Public Health at Queen's, Dr. Dr McKay. Please feel free to unmute and ask me any questions at any time, or alternatively, put some questions in the chat function, and we'll pick those up and answer those. So, as Kieran says, a number of you have sent some questions in during the week. Kieran has sent me a copy of those questions, and I'm going to try and give you a bit of a narrative in terms of answering those questions and how they sort of relate to the topic and specifically to the introduction. So essentially, if you think about what you're looking to do here, the culmination of this 4-week stint is you produce a report. And it doesn't really matter whether it's a report, whether it's a dissertation, whether it's an essay, whether it's a publication or whatever. Writing anything is all about telling a story. And when you tell a story, there needs to be a start, a middle, and an end. And therefore, the start to any type of story essentially is the introduction, because you don't want to lunge straight into the main nuts and bolts of what you're trying to tell someone. You need to actually introduce them to the subject area. And you need to sort of identify what the problem is. So you will have been given a copy or a synopsis of what this 4-week stint entails, and it's really looking at or comparing cardiovascular risk factors. So you will have been provided with the data set, and you'll have an opportunity next week to start looking at that data and interrogate it. But really, the thing here is, I work in public health, and there are lots and lots of public health screening programs ongoing for lots of different diseases and conditions in different age groups. And the question then is, well, what do we screen for? How do we identify what the risk factors are, whether it's for cardiovascular disease or whether it's for something else? How do we identify those risk factors? And the answer to that is we interrogate the data and we identify which risk factors are associated with our disease outcome. So in this instance, our disease outcome is cardiovascular disease. So at this stage, are any of you familiar with what some of the risk factors are associated with cardiovascular disease? So I know Kieran has given you a list, whether it's 1, 2, or 3 risk factors associated with cardiovascular disease. There are multiple risk factors associated with cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is referred to as a complex condition or a complex disease or a multifactorial disease, i.e. what that means is there are multiple factors that contribute to the risk associated with cardiovascular disease. So Kieran and I are both over the age of 50. So if we went to our doctor and we give a blood sample, the doctor might also take some history in terms of, whether we're physically active, how much exercise we get, what our weight is. From our weight and our height, we can calculate our BMI. And our BMI is really is a measure of our height and how much weight we're carrying in relation to our height. It's a rather crude measurement. It's not perfect because, for example, you can have really healthy athletes like rugby players who are really bulky, who have lots of muscle, and muscle's heavier than fat, and therefore they might actually have a high BMI, even though they don't have a lot of body fat. But nevertheless, for the vast majority of the population, BMI is a relatively good or robust indicator of body fat. And therefore, if Kieran and I went to the doctor, we give a blood sample, and let's say one of us was a smoker, we were physically inactive, we got a high BMI or a high level of body fat, we give a blood sample, and that blood sample was then tested for cholesterol, and one of us had a high level of cholesterol. We're both over the age of 50, which puts us in that increased risk category because age is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So the doctor might look at our risk profile and he might calculate a risk score based on those known cardiovascular disease risk factors. And the doctor then might give us some advice based on those known cardiovascular disease risk factors. So the doctor might tell us, stop smoking, become more physically active, go out and take some exercise, try to lose some weight, perhaps change your diet so that you're eating less fatty foods and you're eating more healthy, nutritious foods, such as fruit and vegetables. And he may also prescribe for us some medication, a medication, for example, a statin. A statin is a drug that people can take that actually reduces the level of their cholesterol within their blood, because cholesterol essentially is in a very simplistic way is basically like lots of fat that float around in the blood. And if you ever have washed the dishes at home, for example, and somebody has been frying something on a pan and the pan has got lots of fat from the meat that has been fried on that pan, and you then go to throw that into the sink and without pouring out the fat, and the fat goes down the plug hole, over time what will happen is that fat will solidify within the pipes or within the drain in the sink, and that will eventually lead to a blockage within the sink. And it's essentially the same in terms of our blood vessels. If we go out, we're eating, Burger King or McDonald's or fast food on a regular basis, even at a young age, it's starting to put that fat gets deposited within our body, within our blood vessels, and eventually starts to build up. And over the course of time, and it could be decades, you run the risk of having a blockage that could potentially lead to cardiovascular disease or a heart attack. And so what we're trying to do here with this exercise that we've given you is given you some real data that we've collected in the Royal Victoria Hospital. We've manipulated it a little bit in order to make it a little bit more easier for you to identify which of the risk factors are associated with cardiovascular disease. So you'll have been given a number of different variables to test. Some of them will be significantly associated with cardiovascular disease, and you'll learn how to do that next week. So don't worry about that this week. And the idea then is for you to go on this exercise to try and identify or increase your knowledge as to what the risk factors are for cardiovascular disease. So that's the whole purpose of undertaking this exercise. But getting back more specifically to the introduction and telling the story. Telling the story needs to introduce the story. And so you need to be able to provide an introduction. Now, Kieran would be better placed to give you an indication of how long that introduction should be. But for me, it's not necessarily about the length, it's more about the quality. And in that introduction, you should introduce the subject area of cardiovascular disease. Why is it important? Not only in the context of Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland certainly 20, 25 years ago had some of the highest levels of cardiovascular disease in the world, but cardiovascular disease is the largest killer of people in the world. It outstrips cancer, dementia, everything else. So more people die prematurely each year across the world as a result of cardiovascular disease. So you should introduce what's your main outcome measure here. Your main outcome measure is cardiovascular disease. Then you should introduce some of the risk factors. There's not an expectation that you identify in your introduction all of the risk factors, but I know Kieran has assigned you a number of risk factors with I think, Kieran, correct me if I'm wrong, with the possibility that each student then focuses on one specifically, albeit, or are they doing 3 each?
They're doing 3 as a group, focusing on one and then collaborating and using all 3 in their introduction. So they're doing one by themselves and collaborating on all 3, or if they want to go further, they can do that as well.
Yeah. So, as I said at the start of when I started speaking here, cardiovascular disease does not result as a consequence of a single risk factor. There are multiple risk factors, so you need to be aware of that, and you should highlight that in your introduction. So as Kieran says, if you've been assigned 3 risk factors, you should provide evidence that you've identified from your literature search that identifies those risk factors in the context of cardiovascular disease. And more specifically, if you've been assigned a single risk factor to focus on, that should probably then form the bulk of your introduction, providing some evidence that supports the fact that that particular risk factor is important in terms of cardiovascular disease risk. And it's really by identifying these risk factors, either for cardiovascular disease or indeed any other common disease or condition, that allows the likes of the Public Health Agency and doctors to develop these screening programs, whether it's for breast cancer, cardiovascular disease, or whatever. If we can understand what the risk factors are that lead to an individual being at a higher risk of getting a disease such as cardiovascular disease, then we can help that individual tackle those risk factors to reduce their overall risk of having a heart attack or some form of cardiovascular disease. So that sort of summarizes what the expectation would be in your introduction. And I will re-emphasize again, because for me, it's one of the important things. I don't like reading loads of stuff that is slightly irrelevant. For me, it's more about the quality of what you've got. You're going to be, Richard Fallis showed you how to do a literature search. And from that, you should be able to identify one or more papers associated with your risk factor or with cardiovascular disease. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of papers out there, and don't let that daunt you. We're not expecting you to cite lots and lots of papers. We're just expecting you to be knowledgeable of the literature. And certainly, I don't know if Richard showed you how to identify some review papers, but the review papers are usually, yeah. So the review papers for me are usually the most important, because essentially in an introduction, you're looking to review the literature, and review papers have already reviewed the literature. So if you focus mostly on the review papers, you should be able to get sufficient information from the review papers for your introduction without having to look at primary research articles. So if you can find one or two good review papers, that will probably be sufficient for you to focus on in terms of your trying to formulate your introduction. Now, somebody asked in one of the questions about whether they should do copying and pasting. That's a big no-no, because you should always try to write something in your own words. And it's very obvious when some of our students copy and paste something from the literature. And I would urge you not to do that, because certainly if you go on to university, you become more familiar with issues around plagiarism. And the expectations, certainly in Queen's, are that a student must always write in their own words. Even if they reference something, it's not sufficient to copy and paste something from what someone else has written. So it should always be written in your own words. One of the other questions that one of the students had asked was, is it okay if we see a figure or a table or some sort of diagram in a paper that somebody has published? And can we include that in our introduction or in our report? I would say yes. Those sorts of things are really informative. Sometimes, if you get a nice picture or a nice figure, it can easily explain what people find difficult to put into words. So my answer to that is yes, that is good. If you can find something that is appropriate, you can include that in your report, whether it's in your introduction or perhaps even in your discussion. But make sure you actually reference where you took that figure or that table or that picture from. Make sure you reference that in your list of references at the end of your report. Somebody else also asked, is it written in first person? So I think, I don't know how Kieran feels about this, but certainly I feel that it shouldn't be written in first person. I think it's good practice if you start getting used to not writing in first person. So certainly when our students come to university and they're writing something, unless we specifically ask them to write in first person, we don't really like to see it. So we don't want to see you saying, I did this and I did that. You need to be more general in terms of how you refer to things. And I think that's totally acceptable. There's not the expectation that you should say, we did this or I did that, unless there was a specific requirement within the actual report or the guidelines that wanted you to differentiate your actual contribution to a piece of group work. And I don't think that's the case in this instance.
Only in the method, Gareth. They could certainly do that in the method.
Yeah.
And say in the method, I or we, what we actually did. Yeah, that's totally
so I think under those circumstances, then that is acceptable. But certainly in the likes of your introduction and your discussion, I would recommend that you avoid using the first person. So another question was, is our research to be based on how these factors increase risk of cardiovascular disease, or previous research findings to support that the factors increase the risk of cardiovascular disease? I would suggest it's probably a little bit of both. It depends, I guess, really on the risk factor and how much is known about it. For cardiovascular disease, there's a lot known about all of the major risk factors. So there's not an expectation that you would go into a lot of detail about the biological consequences of a risk factor. So for example, what are the biological effects of smoking? But you might want to include, for example, in cholesterol, you might want to include a general statement or a sentence that perhaps summarizes the biological effect that that particular risk factor might have in terms of cardiovascular disease outcomes. But essentially, you're really, in your introduction, certainly you're really trying to provide more information in terms of what other people have identified as a risk factor associated with cardiovascular disease outcomes, and perhaps the biological consequences of those risk factors may be more appropriate to put within your discussion. So you could have a think about that.
Gareth, it's still okay, isn't it, that I have emphasized to the biochemistry students that they are going to focus on the biological, chemical impacts of the factors that they're looking at, and I've identified their factors for them, like cholesterol and CRP and things like that. That they will go into a wee bit more of the molecular basis and the biological chemical consequences.
Yeah, that's correct. So certainly from you've got twin streams here. You've got biomedical science essentially, and you've got biochemistry. And for the biochemistry stream, there would be an expectation that they're more likely to go into more biological mechanisms or details associated with their risk factor. So again, it's not that we're expecting, reams and reams of information, but an understanding, the demonstration of an understanding of that risk factor, I think, is important, regardless of which stream it is. But certainly for the biochemistry stream, there would be an expectation that there might be more information in terms of the biological consequences of that particular risk factor. So, one of the questions was how to lay out the introduction and what information to include in it. Well, I think hopefully by this stage, from what I've been saying, you've got a good idea of what information needs to be included within your introduction. But certainly what we would be looking to see is, multiple paragraphs, whether you have a paragraph in terms of cardiovascular disease risk, either in Northern Ireland or in the UK, or perhaps globally. You might have a short paragraph on that. That short paragraph may be a number of sentences. And then you might have a paragraph or two in terms of the overall risk factors associated with cardiovascular disease. That might be specifically the 3 risk factors that you've been allocated. And then in addition to that, we would expect to see multiple paragraphs around the single risk factor that you have been allocated in your introduction. And that's really to set the scene of why, or the context of why you're interested in this particular risk factor in relation to cardiovascular disease. So I think, I don't know whether I've covered everything in terms of the questions that have come in. Kieran, if you can think of anything else, in the meantime, I would suggest, Kieran's going to come in now in a minute, but if the students could think about anything perhaps that I haven't covered that they'd like some clarification on, after Kieran is finished, please unmute, or alternatively, write a question in the text box.
Gareth, just to summarize too, and would you check me on this? I am still getting questions on a rough guideline for the introduction, and I am coming back to them with something along the lines of 2 to 3 pages, so between 500 and 750 words as a rough guideline, but emphasizing what you said about quality. The other thing is, I have hopefully emphasized to everybody by an email the font that we prefer, Arial Times New Roman, font size 12. So there was a few people asking about that. And really, you've covered there everything about what you do need and don't need. There's only one tiny question came up this morning about, can you actually use information from an article and then, so quote a little bit of information from an article and then put it into your own words? Is that still a no-no, or are we okay with doing a little bit of that?
No, I think that's the whole purpose of this, is that you're gonna identify, the students are going to identify some relevant research articles, and they're going to then, whether it's a research article, whether it's a publication, or even something in the news, perhaps they might do a Google search or something like that that's relevant, and they read that article, and the expectation is then that they extract some bits of key information from that article or that publication or that bit of news. They extract those key bits of information, and they then put those key bits of information in their own words, and then they cite or reference that particular source from where they've obtained that information.
Good. Yeah.
So okay. Just one other thing just to pick up on there, you mentioned about font and stuff. I can't underestimate or tell you that presentation is really, really important. The last thing that, I end up, some of my class sizes are 120 students, and you give them an assignment, and the last thing that you want to see is everything that's sort of stuck in together. There's not good use of paragraphs. There's not good use of headings or subheadings. Presentation is everything. So think about your presentation. We talked about fonts. We talked about there are different fonts, whether it's Times New Roman, Courier New, or Arial. It doesn't really matter. They're all three very clear fonts that make it easy for us to read. Think about your headings and your subheadings. You might want to have some subheadings. So obviously, I think Kieran might have given you some indication of, for example, an introduction, and methods, results, and either a discussion or a conclusion. But you can have some subheadings under that, should you wish to use them. And what they actually do is they signpost the reader as they're reading through your report. And signposting is actually really helpful for us people who read it or who are marking it, because it sort of breaks down your understanding of the different areas. So again, the use of appropriate diagrams or pictures or figures or tables can help break up lots and lots of text, and make sure you reference those accordingly. And don't forget to actually mention it, because sometimes what some students do is they put in a picture, but they actually forget to mention it in the text as to what it refers to. So presentation is important. I would also recommend using, not double spacing, but 1.5 is probably sufficient. It means then that your text is not all crammed together and stuff like that, and it makes it easier for someone to read your report. So do think about your presentation. At the end, you should have a list of references that you've cited through your report. That's very important, because if you cite some information and somebody's reading your report and they want to go back and check it, they can go back to the original source from which you have cited. And make sure that when you do cite your references, this is one of the problems that our students have on a regular basis, is that they don't cite their references in a consistent manner. So you will find that when you're reading through different journals, they perhaps present their references at the end in a slightly different way. They don't all present their references in the same manner. Some of them do, but some of them may be slightly different. And for me, it doesn't really matter which way that you cite it. You know, so for example, it could be Lynch McKay, and then the year number in brackets, and then the title of the piece of research, and then the journal, and then the issue number, and then the page numbers. It doesn't really matter exactly which way you do it, providing you do it consistently. So we want to see that consistent in all of your references, that they're all cited in the same way. And usually that reflects a student, if that's done properly, it reflects a student who's taken the time and effort to read over their piece of work and to make sure that everything is correct and done properly. Unfortunately, not all of our students do that, but it's often then reflected in the mark that they're given. Many students will do, a lot of students sometimes do it last minute, and that's perhaps reflected in the quality of what they've written.
Gareth, one other thing that came up was, is it okay after or towards the end of your introduction to point out what you think you might find, what sort of prediction, what sort of hypothesis you might find in whenever you go to look at your data set next week? Now, I've already told them I'm going to be showing them statistically how to do null hypothesis based on the questions they want to test on their data. Hypothesis and null hypothesis. And initially I've said to them, well, it's not a big issue at this stage if you have included a prediction or what you think might come up as a result of your research. But the actual testing of those questions and how to word them, we will definitely do very specifically next week in the data analysis.
So I would caveat that a little bit with the fact that, yes, I think it's really good to have that final sentence or two of your introduction with the main aim of this study was to test or to investigate the role of risk factors with cardiovascular disease outcomes, as an example. What I would caution against is trying to preempt what the outcome might be before you actually do the analysis. So, for example, even though you might have researched the subject area and identified perhaps smoking or cholesterol as a risk factor, I would guide against sort of insinuating that your prior expectation is that smoking and high cholesterol will be risk factors associated with cardiovascular disease outcomes. Of course, we know that that's likely to be the case even before you actually investigate the data. However, you don't want to show any bias towards what your expectations might be of your data in terms of what the aim of your report is. So I would suggest leaving it a little bit more generic insofar as you want to say you want to investigate the risk factors, rather than saying, well, the aim of this study is to determine whether cholesterol, increases your risk of, well, you could do that, the aim of this study, particularly if one student has been assigned a particular risk factor, the aim of this study is to investigate the influence or the risk associated with cholesterol and cardiovascular disease outcomes, rather than specifically saying, cholesterol is a risk factor for, cardiovascular disease. So keep it a little bit more open.
Yep. Okay, and then before I put her to the chat, can I just remind everybody that today by 6 o'clock you're going to give me the first draft, and I would like it in a Word document and emailed to me by 6 o'clock. And then we'll open it out now if anybody has specific questions for Dr. McKay about what you've heard now so far in this tutorial.
Yeah, so we've just had a question up, are we able to abbreviate in a report? And yes, abbreviations are excellent. They're an easier way, you know, so cardiovascular disease, CVD is a well accepted or well used abbreviation for cardiovascular disease. However, I would say that any time that you want to use an abbreviation, you should define that abbreviation in your report. So at first use, so the first time you use cardiovascular disease, to put it into brackets in the way that Chloe has done in the chat, where you can then subsequently go on to use just CVD, and you don't actually need to use cardiovascular disease. And so you might also want to do that with, you know, if somebody's doing HDL or LDL, low density lipoprotein, or any other particular abbreviation. Abbreviations are fine, they're good, they're commonly accepted. BMI is another one, but make sure you always define it at the first occasion within which you use it in your report, and thereafter then just use the abbreviation. If you only actually use an abbreviation once, there's not much point in you defining it as an abbreviation if it's not used again.
Anybody else?
So, good question, Chloe. Hopefully that's answered it.
Anybody else wants to unmic or put something in the chat? I think we've something coming, Gareth. It would probably be quicker just to unmic rather than us have to wait to read the chat if anybody wants to do that. What should our title be, Gareth, for the document?
Well, initially we just called it comparison of cardiovascular risk predictors. So I don't see any reason why you want to change from that, unless, Kieran, it would be helpful for you if each student has been allocated a particular risk factor. Unless you wanted in their title, they could put in that individual risk factor more specifically.
I'm happy either way, Gareth, because they've all been allocated 3, so they can either do the predictors or they can do the effect of their 3 factors on cardiovascular disease.
So I probably would be more inclined just to keep it simple in comparison of cardiovascular disease risk predictors. I don't know whether Kieran has given you any naming conventions for the files that you're going to send to him, but in the past, one of the things that I've always found very helpful is to clarify to the students that they should have their name or some sort of identifier in the actual file name that they send. So to make it more, because the problem is then if we don't define that, then, you know, Kieran and I usually end up with 25 files named comparison of cardiovascular disease risk factors. So, you know, put your name on it so that it put your name on the actual file name, so that it more easily allows us to identify which files belong to which individual or which student.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I would have overlooked that one. Okay, anybody else wants to unmic? Yeah, well, Gareth, I'll stop the recording.